I didn't confront him. I didn't expose him. I didn't warn him. I just stopped saving him. The first time I watched him send an email with the wrong date, my stomach actually clenched. My fingers hovered over my phone, muscle memory screaming at me to fix it before anyone noticed. That's when I realized something terrifying. He had no idea how much of his competence wasn't actually his. And for the first time in years, I let the mistake go through. If you've ever been the quiet one, the fixer, the person behind the scenes making someone else look good while you stayed invisible, this story is going to hit uncomfortably close to home. Because sometimes the most brutal revenge isn't loud, it's silence. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever carried someone on your back for years only to be blamed when they finally stumbled? Have you ever been so reliable, so invisible, that people assumed your effort was automatic? If that sounds familiar, hit the like button, subscribe if you believe in quiet justice, and stay until the end, because this isn't a story about sabotage, it's about what happens when protection is finally withdrawn. And trust me, the payoff is worth it. After that night, something subtle but permanent shifted inside me. Not relief, exactly. Relief is too clean a word, too simple. What I felt was more like space, like a room I hadn't known was locked had finally been opened. At first, it felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. I kept waiting for the old tension to rush back in, the low-grade anxiety that had always lived just beneath my thoughts. But it didn't. Instead, there was quiet. Not silence in the dramatic sense, just the absence of urgency. The absence of someone else's problems living rent-free in my head. And that was when I realized how deeply this role had shaped me. Because even after I stopped helping, my body still behaved as if I hadn't. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with a sudden spike of panic, convinced I'd forgotten to remind him of something. I'd reach for my phone before remembering there was nothing to check, nothing to fix, no invisible thread tying my piece to his performance. The habits lingered longer than the responsibility ever should have. That's the part no one warns you about. When you spend years being the buffer, the fixer, the invisible support, you don't just stop doing the work, you have to unlearn the reflex to carry it. I started noticing how often I scanned conversations for problems that weren't mine, how my mind automatically jumped ahead, predicting consequences, planning contingencies, smoothing imaginary conflicts before they even existed. It wasn't just my brother. This role had followed me everywhere. At work, I was the one who caught mistakes before meetings, the one who rewrote emails so they wouldn't offend anyone, the one who stayed late to make sure projects didn't fall apart because someone else hadn't thought things through. In friendships, I was the emotional translator, the one who explained people to themselves, the one who made excuses for bad behavior, the one who kept the peace even when it cost me clarity. I had learned very early on that harmony mattered more than honesty, that things working smoothly mattered more than being seen. And I had learned it so well that it felt like who I was. The truth was harder. It wasn't my personality, it was conditioning. I started replaying childhood moments I had never questioned before. Family gatherings where my brother joked and charmed everyone while I hovered near the edges, anticipating needs before they were spoken. School events where teachers praised him for potential while expecting me to already have everything handled. The way adults spoke to me differently, more seriously, more expectantly, as if I were a co-parent instead of a child. No one ever asked if I wanted that role. They just assumed I could handle it. And when you're told you can handle something long enough, you start believing you should. That belief is heavy. It makes you feel guilty for wanting rest.
selfish for wanting credit, petty for wanting acknowledgement. It trains you to disappear without complaint and call it maturity. I saw it clearly for the first time when my brother started struggling more openly. Without me smoothing things over, the consequences he had never fully faced began to stack up. Not catastrophically, that's important. There was no dramatic downfall, no rock-bottom moment where everything collapsed at once. It was slower than that, more uncomfortable. Missed opportunities instead of outright failures.
Clients who stopped responding instead of complaining. Projects that fizzled out quietly. The kind of losses that don't look serious enough to justify intervention, but painful enough to force reflection. Or avoidance. Mostly avoidance. He became more defensive, more irritable. He talked about being misunderstood, about how people expected too much, about how the system was stacked against him. I listened, but I didn't translate. I didn't reframe. I didn't soften his edges for other people or for himself. And that was new for both of us. There were moments when I almost stepped back in, when he sounded overwhelmed, when his voice carried that familiar frustration that used to trigger my instinct to rescue. I had to sit with that discomfort, had to learn the difference between empathy and responsibility, between caring and carrying. That line is thinner than people think, and I had crossed it so many times that it barely existed anymore. One evening, weeks after the client left, my brother knocked on my door. Not dramatically, just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes tired. He didn't ask for help. That surprised me. Instead, he asked, "Did you know this would happen?" The question caught me off guard. "Know what would happen?" I asked. He gestured vaguely, like the words themselves were difficult to grab onto. All of it, the mistakes, the way things started slipping. I took a long breath before answering. "I knew things wouldn't keep working the same way," I said, "but I didn't know how you'd handle it." He nodded slowly, like he was processing something he'd never fully considered before. "You never said anything," he said, not accusingly, just honestly. "I didn't know I needed to," I replied. That was the closest we came to an apology, and I realized something important in that moment. I had spent years assuming that if I didn't help, things would fall apart completely. But they hadn't. They had changed. He was struggling, yes, but he was also finally seeing the edges of his own responsibility, and that mattered more than comfort. People often talk about boundaries like they're walls, clear, firm, visible. But the most powerful boundaries are invisible. They're the quiet decisions you make not to intervene, not to rescue, not to rewrite someone else's life so they don't have to feel the friction of their own choices. Those boundaries don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves over time, and they change the balance of relationships in ways that feel unsettling at first. Our family dynamic shifted after that, subtly. At gatherings, my mother still glanced at me when something went wrong. Old habits die hard, but I didn't step in automatically anymore. If plans were unclear, I asked questions instead of fixing them. If someone was late, I didn't explain for them. If my brother stumbled over his words, I let the silence sit. It was uncomfortable for everyone, and that's how I knew it was necessary. Discomfort is often the first sign that a system built on invisible labor is being dismantled. There were moments when I was labeled cold, moments when I was told I had changed. I had, but not in the way they meant. I hadn't become less caring. I had become more honest about what care actually costs. I had stopped subsidizing other people's growth with my own energy, and that made people uneasy, because when one person stops carrying more than their share, the imbalance becomes obvious.
Someone else has to pick it up, or it falls. Both outcomes force truth. I began noticing how differently I moved through the world. I spoke more slowly. I paused before responding. I let people misunderstand me instead of rushing to clarify. I let mistakes exist long enough to belong to the people who made them. At first, it felt like negligence. Then, it felt like respect. Respect for myself. Respect for others' capacity to learn. I wasn't robbing anyone by stepping back. I had been robbing them by stepping in. Robbing them of consequence. Robbing them of awareness. Robbing them of growth. And I had been robbing myself of rest, of presence, of an identity that wasn't defined by how well I managed other people's lives. One night, months later, I realized something that stopped me cold. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt anxious about my brother. Not in the sharp, ever-present way that used to hum beneath my thoughts. He still mattered to me, but he no longer lived inside my nervous system. That separation felt like freedom. Quiet, grounded freedom. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. I also noticed something else. People started responding to me differently. Not because I had changed my tone or my words, but because I had changed my availability. I wasn't always there to smooth things over. I wasn't always the fallback plan. And without that, people had to meet me directly. Some relationships deepened, others faded. That told me everything I needed to know. The ones that survived were built on mutual respect. The ones that didn't had relied on my invisibility. I stopped feeling guilty about that, because guilt is often just grief for a version of yourself that was easier for others to use. The final shift came quietly. No confrontation, no big conversation, just a moment of clarity. I was sitting alone one evening, doing absolutely nothing. Not fixing, not planning, not anticipating. Just existing. And it hit me. This is what peace feels like. Not excitement, not relief after a crisis, just steadiness. The absence of urgency. The freedom to be present in my own life. I thought back to that sentence my brother had laughed off month earlier. Oh, my sister forgot to remind me. And I understood why it had hurt so much. It wasn't just the blame. It was the erasure. The casual assumption that my role existed to support his. That my time, my attention, my labor were background features of his life. Stopping didn't make me cruel. It made me visible. Visible to myself first. And that was enough. Because once you see yourself clearly, you stop disappearing for the comfort of others. You stop calling exhaustion generosity. You stop confusing responsibility with obligation. You stop being the invisible role no one talks about, and you finally start living a life that belongs to you. The payoff wasn't watching him fail, it was watching him finally understand. The confusion, the frustration, the slow realization that the world wasn't suddenly unfair, it had always been exactly this demanding. I hadn't ruined his reputation, I had just stopped protecting it. And that distinction, that's what made it so satisfying. I still think about it sometimes, whether it was petty, whether I should have warned him, but then I remember something important. Boundaries aren't betrayal, and silence isn't sabotage. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stop lying on someone else's behalf. If this story gave you chills, hit like. Tell us in the comments, have you ever stopped protecting someone and watched the truth surface? And if you want more stories of quiet revenge, earned justice, and emotional payoffs that linger, subscribe to Taking Revenge Hour, because sometimes the most powerful move is doing nothing at all.